Just after 1 in the morning, a phone rings at Wake County Dispatch. A man's voice comes on the line. He sounds calm, almost too calm. He says he took too much cough medicine the night before. He says he had a dream. He says he turned on the lights, and his wife was on the floor. He tells the dispatcher, "I had a dream, and then I turn on the lights." Then he says something else. He says he thinks he did it. By the time paramedics reach the house on Patuxent Drive, 29-year-old Lauren Phelps has been stabbed more than 100 times. Her husband of less than a year will spend the next several months insisting he doesn't remember any of it, that an over-the-counter cold medicine turned him into someone else for one night. Investigators will spend those same months proving that isn't what happened at all. This is one of the more disturbing cases we've covered, not for the violence alone, but for how long the truth stayed hidden behind a public image everyone believed. If cases like this matter to you, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Now, let's start from the beginning. Lauren Ashley Nicole Hugelmeyer grew up in Kentucky, one of two sisters in a close, religious, tight-knit family. Her parents, Dale and Lori Hugelmeyer, raised their daughters around church and community, and Lauren stayed close to that world her entire life. Those who knew her would later describe her, in court and in interviews, as independent, hardworking, and generous almost to a fault. By her late 20s, Lauren had built a life defined by motion. She worked as an auditor at Quintiles, a Fortune 500 company that runs clinical drug trials for pharmaceutical firms. A serious, detail-driven job that suited her exacting nature. But one income stream was never enough for Lauren. She also worked at a daycare. She sold scented candles. She took on multi-level marketing work on the side. She taught Sunday school at her church. Friends and family would later say this wasn't about needing the money as much as it was about who Lauren was, someone who filled every hour, who believed in showing up, who didn't sit still. She had known Matthew Phelps since middle school in Kentucky, though back then they were little more than classmates. Their paths split in high school. Years later, in their mid-20s, Matthew found her again, this time on Instagram. What began as an online reconnection turned into a long-distance relationship, and then into something that looked, from the outside, like a fairy tale reunion. Two people who'd known each other as kids, finding their way back to one another as adults. They married in November of 2016. From the outside, everything about the marriage looked exactly like it was supposed to. Lauren's family had welcomed Matthew warmly, so warmly that her father would later say they treated him like a son. Matthew was pursuing a path toward ministry, working toward becoming a pastor. To the people around them, it looked like Lauren had found a partner who shared her faith, her work ethic, and her future. What none of them could see, what nobody outside that house on Patuxent Drive could see, was the private world Matthew was building for himself, one his wife wasn't part of, and one that had nothing to do with the man everyone believed him to be. From the outside, everything seemed perfect. But beneath the surface, something else was taking shape. Matthew James Phelps didn't have the stable upbringing Lauren did. His father was largely absent from his life. His mother, who married multiple times, showed little interest in raising him, and it was his grandparents who stepped in to fill the gap. He would later bond with one stepfather, but by most accounts, his childhood lacked the steady foundation Lauren's family had given her. By the time he reconnected with Lauren, Matthew presented as clean-cut, devout, and ambitious, a man studying to become a pastor, someone their community had no reason to doubt. He worked for a lawn service company to help support the household while pursuing that calling. On paper and in person, he fit the role of a devoted husband building a life around faith. But behind that image, Matthew was maintaining something he kept entirely separate from his marriage: a second Instagram account under the name Marty Radical. It wasn't tied to his real identity. It wasn't something Lauren or her family knew existed. On it, he posted images built around death, scenes lifted from the film American Psycho, about a Wall Street banker who murders without consequence or remorse. In some of the posts, Matthew didn't just share the images, he posed as the killer himself. The public version of Matthew Phelps, the future pastor, the grateful son-in-law, the man Lauren's family had folded into their own, was real to everyone who knew him. It just wasn't the whole story. And somewhere behind that image, Lauren had quietly stopped being a partner in his eyes and started becoming something else entirely. By the summer of 2017, the marriage was under strain neither Lauren's family nor their church community could see. Prosecutors would later argue that money was at the center of it. The couple's checking account had been drained. Investigators found more than $1,200 in iTunes and Xbox charges, spending tied to Matthew's video game habits, money the household could not afford to lose. Lauren was working multiple jobs to keep them financially afloat. Matthew, according to prosecutors, could not control his spending. Then there was the account no one knew about. In the days before September 1, 2017, Matthew posted something on Marty Radical that would later become one of the most chilling pieces of evidence in the entire case. A caption reading that everyone thought he was a serial killer and that he'd found an angel to kill. Just after 1 in the morning on September 1, 2017, Matthew called 911. He told the dispatcher he'd taken a large dose of Coricidin HBP cold and cough the night before to help him sleep. He said he'd had a dream. He said he woke up, turned on the lights, and found Lauren on the floor of their bedroom, covered in blood. A knife was on the bed beside them. He told the dispatcher he thought he had killed her, but that he didn't remember doing it. His voice on that call was steady. Not panicked, not disoriented. A man reporting the worst thing that had ever happened in his home, speaking as if he were reading off a grocery list. When officers reached the house on Patuxent Drive, they found Lauren on the floor in a fetal position, clumps of her own hair still clenched in her hands. Evidence, investigators would later say, of a prolonged and desperate struggle. She was rushed to the hospital. She was pronounced dead at approximately 1:45 a.m. An autopsy would later determine that Lauren had been stabbed or cut more than 100 times, a final count of 123 wounds to her head, neck, and torso. This was not a single frenzied strike. This was a sustained, exhausting act that took time and that Lauren fought against for every second of it. Matthew Phelps would spend the hours and days that followed telling anyone who asked the same story. He didn't remember. The cough medicine did this. He wasn't the kind of man capable of this. Investigators were not convinced. Not from the very first hour. The scene itself was the first thing that didn't add up. Something about the house on Patuxent Drive felt arranged rather than discovered, as though it had been staged for someone to walk into and interpret a certain way. Investigators noted this almost immediately. And then there was Matthew himself, a man who claimed to have stabbed his wife over 100 times in a small bedroom during a prolonged struggle, and yet had almost no blood on him. A few drops on his shoes, a few on his shirt. Nothing close to what that kind of violence should have left behind on the person responsible for it. Investigators noticed something that didn't add up, and they built their case one piece at a time. The quercetin defense was the first thing to fall apart under scrutiny. Quercetin HBP cold and cough contains dextromethorphan, and at extreme doses it can cause hallucinations. That much was true. But there was no established medical link between the medication and the kind of sustained, controlled violence Lauren's autopsy described. A man in a genuine drug-induced blackout does not calmly narrate a 911 call. He does not describe finding a knife and putting together, step by step, what must have happened. Matthew's own account of the night was too coherent for the defense he was offering. Then investigators found the second Instagram account. Marty Radical wasn't linked to Matthew's name anywhere on the platform. It took digital forensic work to trace it back to him. And once they did, the account became one of the most damning pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. A private archive of imagery built around murder, around American Psycho, around Matthew literally posing as a fictional killer in photos he never intended his wife or her family to see. Combined with the post from days before Lauren's death, the line about being thought of as a serial killer, about finding an angel to kill, prosecutors now had a digital trail that ran directly counter to the devoted husband image everyone else had believed. The financial picture came next. Investigators pulled bank records and found a checking account bled dry by video game spending, more than $1,200 in charges Lauren likely never knew the full extent of. Assistant District Attorney Kristen Fetter would later tell the court that money problems sat at the root of what happened in that house. A man who couldn't control his spending, married to a woman working multiple jobs to compensate for it. Piece by piece, the investigation reconstructed a portrait completely at odds with the one Lauren's family had welcomed into their lives. The aspiring pastor, the grateful son-in-law, the man Dale Hugelmeyer had made promise, at the altar, to protect his daughter. Underneath all of it, financial desperation, a secret fascination with killing, and a wife who had become, in some private corner of her husband's mind, an obstacle rather than a partner. By the time detectives were finished building their case, the story Matthew Phelps had told the 911 dispatcher, the dream, the cold medicine, the blackout, had collapsed under the weight of everything they found underneath it. This was not a man overtaken by an accidental overdose. This was a man whose private world had been curated, for months, around the idea of violence, long before he ever picked up a knife. Matthew Phelps was charged with first-degree murder. Prosecutors laid out the full case: the physical evidence from the scene, the digital trail from Marty Radical, testimony from people who had witnessed troubling behavior from him, and the financial history that gave investigators a motive to anchor everything else to. His defense would eventually offer a different explanation, not innocence, but context. Attorney Joe Cheshire told the court that Matthew had struggled with depression for years, that he'd been shown slasher films as young as age 4, and that high school friends had introduced him to abusing over-the-counter drugs, including cold medicine, long before he ever met Lauren again as an adult. Cheshire was careful to note that history didn't excuse what Matthew did. It only explained, in part, where some of it may have come from. On October 5, 2018, just over a year after Lauren's death, Matthew Phelps stood before Wake County Superior Court Judge Paul Ridgway and pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. The plea was part of an agreement. In exchange for his guilty plea, prosecutors agreed not to pursue the death penalty. Before I tell you what the court decided, if this is the kind of case you want to see more of, hit subscribe. I cover cases like this every week. Now, the verdict. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom that day was full. Lauren's family, her friends, and members of her church packed the gallery, many wearing blue t-shirts printed with the words, "Lauren's Light," others wearing purple ribbons, the symbol of domestic violence awareness, pinned alongside photos of her face. Roughly a dozen people spoke during a sentencing hearing that stretched nearly 4 hours, describing Lauren as loving, independent, and full of a future that had been taken from her. Matthew had changed since his arrest. Gone was the clean-cut young man in engagement and wedding photos. In his tan jumpsuit, with long, stringy hair and an unkempt beard, he looked almost unrecognizable from the pastor in training everyone once believed they knew. When it was his turn to speak, Matthew addressed his in-laws directly and apologized. He described what he'd done as senseless and said he regretted every step that led him there. He called himself a monster. Lauren's mother, Lori Hugelmeyer, told the court that her daughter had been beautiful inside and out, and that Matthew's actions had changed her forever. Lauren's sister, Beth Agner, described the entire relationship as a game Matthew had played, a deliberate, deadly manipulation of a family's kindness and trust. Lauren's father, Dale Hugelmeyer, reminded the courtroom that he had once asked Matthew, man to man, to protect his daughter. He told Matthew directly that knowing his life was about to become permanently difficult brought him a measure of peace. The verdict was not a celebration. It was the closing of a year-long search for an answer that could never undo what had already happened. The moment a family finally received, in a courtroom, the truth their instincts had told them from the very first phone call. Lauren Hugelmeyer Phelps would be 38 years old today. In another version of her life, the one that was supposed to happen, she would likely still be working her way through the kind of restless, multi-job ambition that defined her 20s. She might have left the auditing world behind for something entirely her own. She might have had the children her friends believed she wanted. She would almost certainly still be showing up for her church, her Sunday school class, the sister and parents who spoke about her with such specificity in that courtroom, because that was who she was long before anyone had heard the words cold medicine defense. Instead, Lauren's name is now most often searched alongside her killers. Her story became a case study, in true crime coverage, in discussions about the limits of intoxication as a legal defense, in warnings about how completely a private life can be hidden inside a public one. Stories like Lauren's deserve to be remembered and told with the care they deserve. If you believe that too, hit subscribe. I cover every case on this channel with the same respect. Now, back to Lauren. What this case leaves behind isn't really a mystery about cough medicine, or even a question about whether Matthew Phelps was telling the truth about that night. It's a much older and more uncomfortable fact that the people closest to us are sometimes the ones we know the least, and that a private life can be built and maintained for years, entirely out of view, by someone we've already decided to trust completely. Lauren Hugelmeyer Phelps was not a headline. She was an auditor who ran 3 side jobs at once. A Sunday school teacher, a daughter whose father made her husband promise, out loud, to protect her, a sister who was, in her own sister's words, deliberately and deadly deceived by someone their family had welcomed as one of their own. That's the person this case should be remembered for, not the man in the tan jumpsuit. Her. If you found this case as disturbing as I did, Subscribe and hit the notification bell for new true crime documentaries every week. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering